Hello, all. My name is Bronwyn Whitney. I'm a professor of physical geography at Northumbria University, and I'm here to speak on behalf of Dr. Rebecca Friedel-Wan and Dr. Samantha Krause on our topic of ancient environmental dynamics and its relevance for Belize. Thank you to the organizer for allowing me to speak today. Just a brief overview of the lecture. I planned to describe what environmental change is, why and how we do it. I want to give some brief examples from the region, but more importantly, talk about its relevance for Belize, for Belizean culture and heritage, and some opportunities for furthering research and education in Belize. So to begin, I'm going to use this word quite frequently, paleo, and paleo simply means ancient. And so I'm a paleoscientist, as is Rebecca and Sam, and we look at past environmental change. So basically an ancient perspective, a longer-term perspective that gives us an understanding of the environmental records beyond what we have recorded or maybe even have in oral history. So it can give us an understanding of what happened hundreds and thousands of years ago. And using paleo-environmental approaches, we can reconstruct or put back together, I guess, different components of the environment, past environmental change. So for example, we can use diatoms, which are unicellular algae, that are preserved in environmental archives to reconstruct hydrological change in the past. I'm a paleoecologist, so I use pollen as a marker of how vegetation has changed. And there are some examples here given below. But I'm going to give you a brief overview to begin with, the applications for paleo-environmental science. And one of the reasons why we do this is to understand what are anthropogenic activities, so human activities in the environment through time, and what are natural climate drivers of change. For example, we might want to look at why land cover has changed in the past and what might be considered to be natural versus unnatural land cover and what that means for conservation. It can give us an understanding how fire has changed. And of course, in the news this year, there have been significant and devastating fires in tropical and subtropical regions. So one of the things that we like to look at as well is understanding how fire has changed through time and whether or not these patterns that we're seeing now are driven entirely by climate, or is there something we can do for land management that might help? Also, paleo-environmental science can help us with conservation ecology, understanding, again, what worked and what doesn't necessarily work through time. The methods that we use, as I pointed out briefly before, is that we look at cores in the environment, such as lake sediment cores. So sediments at the bottom of lakes accumulate through time, and in it they trap environmental signals that reflect the environment at the time that it was deposited. And those signals are likely to be microfossils or chemical changes. Equally, if you can stand on top of the surface, such as in a swamp, like a palm swamp, you can take a core from that surface as well. And so we'll often look at swamps and peatland cores. One of the things that's relevant for Belize is cave records. So things like these stalagmites, they grow incrementally through time, and they also capture records of what the climate was like at the time that they were deposited. So using these methods, we analyze how past environments have changed. So to provide a few examples from Belize, starting with the speleothem records or cave records, you can see in a bit more detail where you've got these records, by the way, are not from Belize, but they've been provided by a colleague. But you can see how the layers incrementally accumulate through time, and within those are those signals of growth layers. So for the examples in Belize, if we combine cave records and lake records together, we can look at paleoclimate from both Belize and the broader region. So this is shown by a paper that Sam was involved in, and you can see the triangles across the Yucatan Peninsula represent points where we have paleo-environmental records. And so those, for example, will show droughts that happened in various points in ancient Maya history, particularly from the late terminal classic to post-classic. And by comparing those records to the archaeology in the region, for example, we can see where people have controlled water as part of management strategies to mitigate perhaps against some droughts in the past. I'm more of a paleoecologist, so I study past ecology through time, and the way that we do that is by looking at lake and swamp records and the pollen that is produced by plants being trapped in the bottom. Now, this little cartoon here represents Northern European style vegetation, but the principles are very much the same. That when you go further back through time, down into the core, you get different relative abundances of different pollen types, and that tells us what the vegetation was like through time. So in this example, you've got lots of little blue dots, which are supposed to represent spruce pollen, and they become less abundant compared to the other types of plants that come in through time, such as the beech and the chestnut, shown through here. And we use the exact same methods in Belize. Obviously, it's a much more diverse country in terms of biodiversity, so it's a little bit more complicated, but we as I point out, we use the same methods. The problem is that particularly when it comes to communicating paleo-environmental change, is that the standard presentation of results can be actually quite difficult to view. I mean, this is how we would present our pollen data through time, and it's just showing the relative abundance of different types of plants in these different curves. But you can at least understand that there's change happening within this diagram. You can see where certain colors are going up and certain colors are going down through time, and time is represented here on this y-axis. So rather than going through all of this records, talking about this graph, which is quite tricky to see, I'm going to give you an example with New River Lagoon and Lamanai, so the temple site of Lamanai, which is right next to the New River Lagoon, and discuss what changes we've seen there in paleoecology. So again, you're probably familiar with, of course, all the New River Lagoon, and we have two cores from this region, one from right next to the temple sites and one that's further south, but a kilometer further south towards the settlement of Indian Church. And these are lake sediment cores where we analyzed pollen in them, and there's some more work currently being done both by in paleoecology, but also in paleoclimate and signals of chemical change as well that are happening at this that we hope to get out soon. But the published record so far shows that there's a lot of really interesting land use changes that happen across the ancient Maya period. And particularly we see in the very early period of Maya settlement that there's some forest cleared and crop cultivation begins in the really early pre-classic period. So we're talking about 3,000 years ago. And then rather than full clearance continuing, which we see in some records of the ancient Maya world, in this particular part, we actually see palm management beginning. So a whole lot of palms come into the records, and this lasts from the pre-classic right through to the post-classic, this intensification of land use through periods of known drought. But people are growing palms, so using agroforestry practices, and it's really quite interesting and not really often seen in a lot of pollen records. Then once we get into the post-classic and into the colonial period, we see the land use changes associated with colonization. We see palm land management ending and also forest and pine regrowth in certain areas. But we have cultivation of maize and various other crops throughout the entire record happening here. Now, this is the record that's next to the temple site. If we then move a little bit further south towards the settlement of Indian Church, our record picks up here in this period where we have the early to post-classic signal. So it overlaps here in time frame, and we see a very similar scenario where there's pines that have been cut throughout the savanna for use, and there's intensive land use, and again, a lot of palm cultivation. But then we see this very slow change throughout the post-colonial period as people are no longer so much focused at the temple site, but they're actually further south, and they are continuing with palm cultivation, though a little bit less. But we see a diversity increase, and we think perhaps people are doing more of a forest garden style of cultivation in the post-classic period here. Finally, with the colonization period, and particularly during the British period, we see the end of some of these practices and also the timber trade extraction happening in the savannas, which is clearly an indication of that sort of extractive resource industry. In the late 20th century, with Belizean independence, we have the establishment of the Lamni Reserve and some of the highest biodiversity in the record. So our key findings from Belize is that we see resilience and adaptation in the land use practices in response to climate change across a lot of this records of the ancient Maya civilization, almost near continuous cultivation of the forest soils, not on the savanna side, but on the forest side throughout the entire records. People are always growing things, and they're shifting a little bit about how they're doing things and where they're doing it. And interestingly, as I pointed out, we see these agroforestry practices of palm cultivation that is happening throughout most of this record, and it simply shifts away from the temple site during the post-classic period. Now, why are we so interested about why this is relevant for Belize in the modern day? Well, of course, this is part of Belizeans' cultural heritage. The environment is, and how people manage it is, in fact, part of that heritage. And we're interested as a group in valuing and promoting this heritage, this environmental heritage of Belize. It also shows us potentially sustainable management practices in the past. We can look at what people used to do during periods of drought, and that might make us think about what might be useful in the future. It's really important for the conservation of the natural environment, because without knowing what is actually human interventions in forestry versus what is natural, we can't necessarily have a good test for how we might conserve something. We might not have a good management strategy for conservation. So we have to know what is natural and what is human, and preserving some of those human interventions is necessary where they work. It also gives us an idea of testing models, potential models for sustainable development, and understanding the response of different systems under different human and climate pressures. It also gives us a chance of looking at extreme environmental events, so potentially storm frequency, patterns of historical drought. Didn't get into this into great detail, but these are the sorts of things that we can also probe using paleo science and paleo background. Of course, however, we have some barriers to this research in Belize, as well as some opportunities. And I'll start with, some of the barriers is that paleoscience is mostly undertaken by scientists from outside Belize. And this is for a variety, I guess, stems from a variety of reasons, but it shouldn't stay this way. I mean, those reasons are that, mostly expensive laboratory facilities are needed. It can be quite expensive and time consuming as far as research is concerned. So the research intensive universities from outside the country have historically been a bit more involved in doing this. We also have some unmet capacity in teaching and learning in this particular style of science in Belize. We also have a problem that we make our papers communicated through scientific articles, and that can be pretty inaccessible to the general public. So as a group, what we'd like to see is to start to address this inequality, to consider how we can do better and broader communication of findings across a range of different levels of governance and educational organizations in Belize, how we can better build research collaborations with archaeologists, but more importantly, local universities and communities, to bring in perspectives of Belizeans into research design, creation, and dissemination. And also the really big one at present is to try to build more capacity in education in paleo science in Belize. So what is happening? Well, some of us tried to make a bit of a start. I had some undergraduate students visit me from Galen as part of a project to begin to build capacity in education and to start with a knowledge exchange with Galen. We're exploring opportunities to build better education capacity, both at Galen University, but also through other research organizations. And this is certainly something that Rebecca is building upon, including plans to include paleoecological education at community events through the Heritage Education Belize. But, this is going to be a long road, and certainly suggestions and thoughts are very welcome. So thank you to all, and I will leave it there.